as perfect even though life rarely follows the plan, and she wondered if Jake understood that yet, or if tonight would teach him in a harder way. Hours passed faster than she expected, and when headlights finally cut through the rain outside, her heart skipped without reason. The front door opening not with laughter or excitement, but with a slow, heavy sound, and Jake stepped inside looking smaller somehow, soaked from the rain, shoulders slumped, eyes distant, the joy he had carried out of the house completely gone, and Emily knew instantly that something had broken inside him, something fragile and new. And though she told herself to give him space, her instincts pulled her closer as she watched him slip off his shoes without a word, avoiding her eyes, moving like someone trying not to be seen. She called his name softly, not as an authority, but as someone who cared, and he stopped, frozen for a moment, before turning around with a forced smile that fooled no one, and in that look Emily saw disappointment, embarrassment, and a quiet shame that didn't belong to him, but had found him anyway. She asked him if he was okay, keeping her voice calm, simple, safe, and he nodded too quickly, the lie obvious, but instead of pushing, she stepped aside and let him breathe, and in that small act, the space between them changed, not crossing any line, but opening a door. Jake finally spoke, his words rushed and uneven, explaining how the night had not gone the way he imagined, how expectations had met reality and lost, how he felt foolish for believing it would be special just because he wanted it to be. And Emily listened without interrupting, letting the story unfold fast and raw, understanding that this moment was not about advice, but about being heard. The rain outside grew louder, as if matching the pace of his emotions, and Emily felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, knowing that her response mattered more than she realized, because first heartbreaks leave marks that can shape a person for years. She chose her words carefully, offering no judgment, no dramatic comfort, only truth spoken simply, telling him that growing up often begins with disappointment, that wanting something deeply does not guarantee it will happen the way we hope, and that feeling hurt does not make him weak. And as she spoke, Jake's breathing slowed, his shoulders easing just a little, the sharp edge of his pain softening as he realized he was not alone in it. Emily was aware, even in that moment, of the delicate balance she had to keep, of the role she held in his life as a stepmother, a guide, not a replacement for anything else, and she kept that line clear by grounding the moment in care rather than closeness, presence rather than intimacy. The clock ticked past midnight before Jake finally nodded, thanking her quietly, and headed to his room, leaving Emily alone again in the kitchen, the rain still falling, the house still silent, but now filled with the echo of a moment that could not be taken back. And as she stood there, she understood that tonight was not just about Jake's first disappointment, but about the start of a change neither of them had planned, a turning point where innocence met reality, and where her involvement, though careful and appropriate, would become part of a memory that shaped who he would become, whether for better or worse. And as the rain finally began to slow, Emily hoped with everything she had that this night, painful as it was, would lead him toward strength rather than regret, because some beginnings arrive disguised as endings, and some lessons come sooner than expected. Morning came without peace, and Emily Carter woke before the alarm, her mind already moving fast, replaying the night before not in detail but in feeling, the weight of Jake's disappointment lingering in the quiet house. And when she stepped into the kitchen, she found him already there, sitting at the table with a mug he hadn't touched, staring out the window as if the grey sky held answers he couldn't reach. And for a moment they shared silence that felt heavy but honest, the kind that says more than words. Emily moved carefully, aware that this part mattered just as much as the night before, because pain doesn't disappear after one conversation, it stretches, reshapes itself, and asks to be understood again. And when Jake finally spoke, his voice was steady but tired, explaining more clearly what he couldn't say before, how he felt embarrassed not because things didn't work out, but because he believed something was wrong with him, how he thought that if his first real experience failed, maybe he had already failed at something important. And Emily listened closely, recognizing that this was not about romance, but identity, about a young man measuring himself too early against expectations he didn't create. She responded with honesty that stayed grounded, telling him that worth isn't proven in one night, that adulthood isn't earned through moments, but through how a person handles disappointment. And she shared parts of her own past carefully, not stories but truths, admitting that she too once believed first moments defined everything, only to learn later that they are often the least accurate reflections of who we become, and Jake absorbed her words slowly, asking questions not about love, but about fear, about how people move forward when confidence cracks. And Emily answered without pretending to have perfect answers, saying that moving forward usually starts with accepting discomfort instead of running from it. The conversation flowed faster, as the morning went on, no pauses filled with tension, just steady honesty, and Emily made sure to keep boundaries clear, reminding Jake gently that support comes from many places, that leaning on family is healthy but growth also requires space, friendships, time, and self-reflection, and Jake nodded, not defensive, just thoughtful, realizing perhaps for the first time that healing was something he had to participate in, not something someone else could give him. Later that day, as Emily went about her routine, she noticed changes already beginning, small but meaningful, Jake opening up to his friends through messages, taking a walk alone instead of hiding in his room, choosing movement over silence. And while the house remained calm, an emotional current ran through it, as if both of them understood they were walking through a fragile moment that required care. That evening, they talked again briefly, not deeply this time, just enough to check in, and Emily felt relief when Jake spoke with less heaviness, his words clearer, his eyes steadier, and yet she sensed a new challenge forming, not danger, but attachment, the kind that can grow when someone feels truly seen during a vulnerable moment, and Emily took this seriously, choosing her tone wisely, reinforcing independence while still offering encouragement, reminding him that strength doesn't come from being rescued but from learning to stand after falling. Days passed quickly, each one bringing small progress, Jake returning to normal routines, laughing again, though quieter than before, and Emily observed without hovering, proud but cautious, understanding that her role was not to replace a loss or become a central emotional anchor, but to guide him back to balance. One afternoon, Jake thanked her openly, telling her that her words had helped more than he expected, that he felt less broken and more aware. And Emily accepted the gratitude with warmth while gently redirecting the credit back to him, saying that he was the one doing the work, that all she did was listen, and in that exchange, something important settled between them, mutual respect without confusion. Still, Emily wrestled privately with her own emotions, not attraction or regret, but responsibility, knowing how easily moments of care can be misunderstood if not handled with maturity, and she stayed alert, making sure conversations stayed appropriate, encouraging outside support, keeping life moving forward rather than circling around pain. As the week ended, Jake seemed lighter, not healed but stronger, and the house felt more balanced, less tense, as if the storm that started that night had passed without leaving destruction behind. And Emily knew that part 2 of this story was not about fixing anything, but about understanding, about learning that disappointment doesn't need drama to be meaningful, and that sometimes the most powerful involvement is knowing when to step closer and when to step back, allowing growth to happen naturally, quietly, and with dignity. And as Emily watched Jake leave the house one evening with friends, she felt a calm certainty that this chapter, though painful, was shaping him into someone more thoughtful, more grounded, and that whatever came next would be faced with more awareness than before, because lessons learned through honesty tend to stay, and this one had already begun to change him. The shift came quietly, not with drama, but with awareness, and Emily Carter felt it in the way the house moved around her, in the pauses between conversations and the careful looks Jake Miller gave her, as if he were measuring something he did not yet understand. And she knew this stage would matter more than comfort ever could, because growth requires distance as much as support. And one afternoon, as sunlight filled the living room, Jake sat across from her and admitted that he felt pulled between gratitude and confusion, not about her intentions, but about his own emotions, about how safety can feel powerful when someone is hurting. And Emily responded without hesitation, steady and clear, telling him that feelings after disappointment can blur meaning, that closeness in difficult moments does not always point towards something deeper, and that learning to name emotions instead of following them blindly is part of becoming an adult. She spoke plainly, without softness that could be misread, reminding him that boundaries exist to protect trust, not to remove care. And Jake listened, his face serious, understanding settling in even if it stung a little, because clarity often does. And from that day forward, Emily changed the rhythm of their interactions, keeping conversations shorter, purposeful, focused on progress rather than pain. encouraging Jake to fill his time with things that reminded him of who he was outside that night: work shifts, workouts, study, goals, friendships, anything that built confidence through action. Jake responded with effort, signing up for extra hours, reconnecting with friends he had avoided, forcing himself into routines that felt uncomfortable but grounding. And though some evenings he still felt the pull to talk, to lean back into the ease of Emily's understanding, he respected the space she created, realizing slowly that it wasn't rejection, but direction. Emily watched him closely but from a distance, resisting the urge to step in when silence appeared, trusting that strength grows in quiet moments, and she dealt with her own thoughts privately, acknowledging that caring deeply does not mean staying central, that sometimes love is measured by restraint, not presence. Weeks moved quickly, and Jake changed in ways that surprised even him, his posture straightening, his voice gaining confidence, his laughter returning naturally rather than forced, and one night over dinner, he spoke about plans, future goals, travel ideas, things that reached beyond the small circle of his past hurt, and Emily felt relief, knowing the lesson was taking root. Still, there was one moment that tested everything. A late evening when Jake came home frustrated after an argument with friends, emotions high, words tangled, and he almost crossed the line back into dependence, seeking reassurance the way he once had, and Emily met the moment calmly, listening briefly before guiding the conversation outward, suggesting rest, perspective, time, refusing gently to become the center of his emotional world again. And though Jake felt disappointment, he also felt respect, understanding that support does not always mean closeness, and that self-reliance is built through repeated choices. After that night, something settled firmly between them, a mutual understanding grounded in maturity, and the house felt balanced again, not quiet with tension but calm with purpose, and Emily knew that part 3 was never about conflict, but about discipline, about learning when to hold a line even when emotions push against it. Because blurred lines don't just confuse relationships, they slow growth. As spring approached, Jake stood more firmly in himself, no longer defined by one moment or one conversation, and Emily felt confident that the most difficult part had passed, not because pain was gone, but because it no longer controlled direction. And as she watched Jake leave one morning with a clear stride and focused eyes, she understood that this chapter was shaping him into someone stronger, someone who would carry the lesson forward without needing reminders, because the most meaningful guidance often happens when words stop and space does the work. And in that space, Jake was finally learning who he was becoming. Spring arrived without asking permission, and with it came a lightness that Emily Carter noticed in small ways at first: the windows open more often, music playing again, Jake Miller moving through the house with purpose instead of hesitation, and it became clear that the difficult season was ending not with a dramatic moment, but with steady change built day by day, because Jake had begun to understand that his life was larger than one disappointment and stronger than one memory. He focused on work, saving money, planning small goals, and each step forward added confidence that no conversation alone could have given him, and Emily watched quietly, choosing observation over involvement, proud of the distance that now felt healthy rather than cold. One afternoon, Jake came home, excited about a college visit he had taken with friends, talking fast, full of ideas, and Emily listened with a smile that carried relief, realizing this was the sound of someone moving forward on his own strength, not leaning on the past for balance, and she encouraged him without directing, asked questions without guiding, letting him own his choices fully. Time moved quickly after that, weeks blending into months, and the memory of that night faded into context instead of control, no longer something that defined Jake, but something that informed him, a lesson stored rather than relived. Emily reflected often on her own role, understanding now that involvement does not always mean closeness, that sometimes the most responsible care is knowing when to step back so someone else can step up. And she felt grateful that she had trusted that instinct even when it was uncomfortable. Jake grew more independent, spending more time out, building friendships, even showing interest in someone new, not rushing, not expecting perfection, but approaching life with patience he didn't have before. And when he mentioned this casually one evening, Emily felt a quiet sense of success, not because of details, but because of the calm way he spoke, free from fear and pressure. There was one final conversation that closed the chapter completely. A simple moment in the kitchen where Jake thanked Emily again, not with emotion-heavy words, but with maturity, saying that what mattered most wasn't what she said, but how she trusted him to grow on his own. And Emily accepted that with grace, reminding him that growth belongs to the person who does the work, not the one who witnesses it. After that, life settled into normal rhythms, shared meals, passing conversations, mutual respect filling the space where tension once lived, and the house felt lighter. As if it too had learned something important. Emily understood that stories like this are often misunderstood from the outside, reduced to assumptions, but the truth was quieter and stronger. A story about guidance without control, care without confusion, and learning how to handle emotional moments with responsibility. Jake moved forward into adulthood not unmarked, but wiser, carrying the understanding that first times are rarely perfect and never final, that mistakes are teachers, not verdicts, and that dignity comes from how one responds, not what one loses. As summer approached and plans filled calendars, Emily stood one evening watching the sunset through the same window where rain once fell, feeling at peace, knowing that her involvement had never been about crossing lines or creating dependency, but about helping someone stand steady when the ground shifted, and then trusting them to walk on their own. The story ended not with regret or longing, but with balance. A quiet ending shaped by maturity, where everyone stayed in their place, learned what they needed to learn, and moved forward stronger than before, proving that sometimes the most meaningful turning points leave no noise behind, only growth.